We're ready to start. Lesson 7.1, page 497, percents, decimals, and fractions. So if you could turn there, page 497. So the meaning of a percent. Percent actually means per hundred. So writing a number as a percent is a way of comparing the number with 100, according to the textbook, middle of page 497. So the number 42% is actually comparing this number with 100. So it can actually be written as 42 over 100. So out of 100, we've got 42. So 42 red Skittles to 100 total would be 42% are red. So really all they're doing for examples 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 is writing your percent as a fraction, and all you're doing is taking the percent sign off, writing it as a fraction with the number on top and 100 on the bottom. So page number 498, changing percents to decimals. So if we have a percent such as 25%, in order to change that to a decimal, we rewrite it as 25 over 100 and divide 25 divided by 100 is 0.25. And there's our percent to a decimal. Now if we do that with 75%, we have 75 over 100, which is 0.75. Okay. One thing that you notice between the what we did here and what we did here is the numbers did not change. We still have a 2 and a 5, a 2 and a 5, a 7 and a 5, and a 7 and a 5. So that brings us to what happens when you change 25% to a decimal, 75% to a decimal, 36% to a decimal. All that happens is the decimal that we normally would have placed right here, 25, 75, and 36, moved 2 places each time. That is consistently true whenever you change percents to a decimal. So instead of having to take 36 divided by 100 and getting the decimal, all we have to do is take the percentage sign off, move the decimal 2 over, and we're done. So that's all there is as far as changing percents to a decimal. But of course there's always something a little bit challenging for you to forget. So let's look at a couple of those. 3.62%. We could write that as 3.62% over 100, just to make sure we're right. Or we could move the decimal place over 2. Well, we don't have 2 decimal places to move it. We could move it here, but we don't have another place. Well, we move it anyway and put it there. And because we have an empty space there, we put a 0 there. So actually what we did is we moved from 3.62 over 1, 2 to 0.0362. Same is true if we have 0.4%. We're also going to move the decimal over 2. So it moved over 1, 2. So we have 0.004. So it was there, we moved it, it was there, we moved it over 2, 1, 2. And that is where we got the 0.004. So if you're going to move it over more than the number of digits that you're given, you're going to have to put a 0 where the place holder is, where there's nothing there. Okay, changing decimals to percents. Just going the other way around. So 0.42, in order to change from, well, let's put the answer up here, goes to 42%. In order to change this to a decimal, we move the decimal over 2 and got 0.42. In order to go from a decimal to a percent, we move the decimal back, move it to the right 2, and put the percent sign on. So 4.89, to change that back to a percent, we're going to move it over 2 and get 489%. If we have 0.2 and we want to change that to a percent, we're going to have to move it over 2, but again, we don't have 2 places, so we add a second place. So we moved it from here, 1, 2, to here. Okay. 25. Move it over 2. It's right now, it's right there, right? So to move it over 2, we add 2 more zeros. So 25, written as a percent, is 2500%. Which brings us to page 500. And this is section D, changing percents to fractions. So rather than taking 19% and changing it to a decimal by moving the decimal point over 2, we're going to change 19% to a fraction. So in order to do that, we're going to change this to 19 over 100 and divide that out. And you can do that with any percent. You just take the percent over 100, cross out the percent sign, and go ahead and divide that out, and you get 19 over 100, which at this point doesn't reduce. You just leave it there because we are changing it to a fraction, not to a decimal. We already figured out how to do the decimal part. So if we have 4.5% and we're trying to change that to a fraction, we're going to write it as 4.5 over 100. And again, we want it as a fraction, so we're not going to divide. But we never leave a decimal in a fraction. We never combine those two. So if you remember from a while back, in order to get rid of this decimal, we multiply the top and the bottom by how many zeros it would take to get it to be a whole number. So from 4.5 to 45, we have to move this decimal over 1, so we multiply it by 1 0. So I've got 1 0 here because I moved it over 1. I also multiply the bottom. So I get 45 then over 1,000. Then I reduce that to 9 over 200. Don't forget to reduce these as you're going through. We've got something like 32.5%. That is actually, you could do it 2 ways. You could write this as 32.5 over 100, multiply this by 10 and this by 10 because you're moving the decimal 1. Or you could write this as a mix or an improper fraction as 65 over 2 divided by 100. Which would give me 65 over 2 times 100 over 1 over 100 because we're inverting and multiplying, and you get 65 over 200, and then you'd have to reduce that. So either way works. Change it to an improper fraction and then divide through, or change it as a decimal, 32.5, and then get rid of the decimal there. So either one works there. Alright, let's look at page 501, and we're changing fractions to percents. So we have a fraction like 3/8, and we're looking at changing that to a percent. Well, what I would suggest doing is divide it, make it into a decimal. You can't change a percent or you can't change a number into a percent unless it's a decimal. So that's a key thing when you're doing that. You can't change a number into a percent unless it's a decimal. So let's change this into a decimal. 3 divided by 8 is 0.375. Now we can change it into a decimal by moving it over 2 and get 37.5%. Same thing with 5 over 12. Change it to a percent first, which would be 0.4166, and then let's turn it into a percent, move it over 2, and there we go. Alright, we'll try a couple problems of 7.1 on the next video.